During Piers Morgan's latest U.S. politics panel, friend of the show and progressive activist Wajahat joined former Fox News host Julie Roginsky to brutally steamroll Morgan's defense of Trump's defense secretary nominee Pete Hegseth, as well as the notion that Republicans should condition federal assistance to California. The whole thing is glorious and we have to talk about it. But before we do, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, we got a couple of clips of this recent Piers Morgan episode. It was Piers Morgan, Michael Knowles from The Daily Wire, Dave Rubin from The Dave Rubin Show or whatever he does at this point, versus Wajahat and Julie Roginsky. So again, going back to form of stacking the deck against the liberals, outnumbering them 3-1 because, of course, Piers is not a neutral arbiter. So we're going to play three clips. The first two have to deal with Pete Hegseth, former Fox and Friends weekend host, who is Trump's defense secretary nominee. And we're going to start with Waj, who just nails it, per usual.
Look, I know that Republicans actually like affirmative action because they're perfectly fine with mediocre MAGA men and lowering the standards to the point where Pete Hegseth, the Fox News host, can slither under it and be the Secretary of Defense. For people who don't know, the Secretary of Defense overlooks a budget of over $900 billion, 3 million people. He is responsible in particular for defense policymaking. We're talking about law and order, national security. You're going to give it to Pete Hegseth, a man who was in the National Army Guard. His fellow colleague in the Guard looked at his tattoos and actually reported him to be an insider threat because it was so extreme. This is a man who wrote a book called American Crusade. In his book, Pete Hegseth said, "I am too extreme for the U.S. military." In his book, Pete Hegseth said, "I support these militias, these paramilitary forces." In his book, he calls the enemies liberals extremists. So much for unity. This is a man, not just adultery, but sexual impropriety. He has been alleged of sexual impropriety and sexual assault. If he has nothing to hide, release the woman that he has signed to an NDA and paid off. Let her tell her story. This is a man whose own mother sent one of the most damning emails I have ever heard and read in my life. If your mother sends the email that Pete Hegseth's mother said you have failed in life, accusing him of being a sexual abuser, a man whose own Fox colleagues have said, allegedly in the New York Times, that they're worried about his alcoholism and alcohol problem, and a man who has economic impropriety allegations. He was released from 2 nonprofits. What are we doing here, Piers? Listen, with Mark...
He's so, again, well, I'm going to let Waj finish here, but he's just so damn good. One of the things I love about Waj is he's one of those progressive activists and liberal activists who actually likes to talk shit and play a little rough the way that conservative commentators often do with the rest of us, and I love it.
Marco Rubio, I disagree with him. You don't see me here complaining. Qualified guy, intelligent guy, Secretary of State, fine. Pete Hegseth as Secretary of Defense, what are we doing? You guys are putting lipsticks on a pig, and you're making America less safe. And the right wing in MAGA is doing this for Pete Hegseth.
Okay.
You're making this country less safe just because you're bending the knee to Donald Trump, and he wants...
So damn good. Again, I love that Waj tirade. I love it. It's so good. And again, I actually appreciate that he took the time to distinguish, for example, his objections to Pete Hegseth compared to Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio will pass with wide bipartisan support. He's a former Republican senator from Florida, and yes, I think he is a coward in so many ways. He has cringe neoconservative viewpoints, and I think that he will sacrifice those on the altar of Trump for political convenience. But there's no question he's smart and he's qualified. He knows his shit. Right? So would I vote for him if I were on the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee? No, probably not, just because, again, I think it's cowardice with respect to Trump. But if I were simply evaluating him based on his theoretical qualifications, there's no question that Rubio is qualified to be Secretary of State. Pete Hegseth is not qualified to be Defense Secretary. He has never had any sort of robust command in the military, let alone, like, he hasn't commanded a battalion or a company or an army. Yes, he is a decorated combat veteran, but so too is the current Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, appointed by President Biden, and Piers Morgan nor Michael Knowles nor Dave Rubin are fans of his. So this idea that simply being a combat veteran makes you decorated is patently absurd. To say nothing of the alleged moral transgressions that are attributed to Pete Hegseth. So, and of course, again, as Waja points out, his stewardship of 2 nonprofits. The guy's a disaster. However, reportedly, Pete Hegseth has the votes to get confirmed. So it's fait accompli at this point. Now I want to play a clip on the topic of Hegseth. And this is in some ways even more interesting because Julie Roginsky has personal experience with Pete Hegseth. And she makes a really compelling case here for which Piers Morgan and his two MAGA sidekicks, Dave Rubin and Michael Knowles, really don't have much by way of redress.
Well, I will explain in 1 second. Let me go back to something that was said in the very beginning, that he spent more than 10 years at Fox News, and that's what qualifies him to be in this position that he wants to be in. I spent more than 10 years at Fox News. I don't think I'm qualified to run the DOD whatsoever based on my time at Fox News.
I said that was one of the things.
If you, well, I don't think that's even a remote qualification. That's one.
Being able to communicate ideas as the Secretary of Defense and explain policy is actually a very big part of the job.
There are plenty of qualified Republicans out there who can run the DOD who also are good on television. It does not need to be Pete Hegseth. Secondly, again, you talked about NDAs. I am bound by an NDA at Fox News. If I were not bound by an NDA and if Fox News wanted to release me from that NDA, I could tell you about my time with Pete Hegseth. Unfortunately, that's not possible. But I will say that the reason that there are so many people who anonymously came forward at Fox News is that because they're also bound by confidentiality provisions, which 1/3 of all American workers need to sign on their first day of work. And if they were to go public, they could get sued. The reason this accuser is not heard from is because, according to the New Yorker, she tried desperately to meet with Joni Ernst on the committee, and Joni Ernst turned her down. So the reason that she has not been able to come out publicly is because she has an NDA, and even privately, she could not meet with a senator on this committee who's also a rape survivor to share her story, because that rape survivor did not want to hear from a woman who was going to put her potentially in a position to vote against Pete Hegseth. Pete Hegseth has written himself while at Princeton, saying that women who are passed out, if you have sex with them while they're unconscious, that's not really rape, right? Now, the American military has a tremendous sexual assault problem, a horrible sexual assault problem. I have spoken to women in the military who say on deployment, it's not a question of if, but a question of when they will be sexually assaulted. You cannot possibly have somebody running our military who has said that women who are unconscious deserve to be raped because it's not really rape. You can just go have your way with them. So I don't know which soldiers you've been talking to who think Pete Hegseth is a great thing for the military. There's not one woman out there who cares about being assaulted on deployment who thinks that this is the person that needs to be in charge of the United States military.
That's really powerful stuff. That's a really powerful response by Julie Roginsky, again, for which there is no real refutation. Like, you could see Piers, who is inclined to play things pretty smugly, and interrupt and heckle his guests at times. He just gave her a wide berth there, as well he should, because you really have no refutation for that. This idea that all these accusers are anonymous. Well, again, there are NDAs in the equation, and as far as we know, Pete Hegseth has not released his accusers from those NDAs. There's reporting to the contrary, as a matter of fact. So add that again to the mountainous pile of reasons why Hegseth is remotely unqualified to be defense secretary, even though he almost certainly will become defense secretary. So one last clip from this episode, also featuring Julie Roginsky, in which the topic turns to conditioning federal disaster relief to blue states like California. She makes a really powerful point that, again, Piers Morgan and others really don't have an answer for.
Yeah.
I would say to you, however, the larger issue here is that California is not the only state that deals with natural disasters, and Republicans will not be in charge forever. What goes around comes around. And I would be very, very wary of throwing out these kinds of contingencies, because one day Donald Trump will not be president. One day Mike Johnson will not be speaker. One day there will be Democrats sitting in both those offices. And one day Louisiana, Mike Johnson's home state, or Florida, Donald Trump's home state, probably sooner rather than later, is going to have a horrible natural disaster. And on that
it's
day,
already happening.
when that happens,
but we have them, and we have competent governance.
Of course.
Have you met Ron DeSantis?
Plenty of Democrats. This happens all the time. Listen, I'm from New York, and I recall very clearly when Ted Cruz would not vote for Hurricane Sandy relief, and then a few years later, all of a sudden, this horrible situation in Texas happened, and he came crawling hat in hand to New York senators and to New York members of Congress, begging them for money for Texas. So if you want to go down this road, feel free. If you want to take advantage of people's natural disasters, feel free. But the reality is, when that
Piers,
happens
can I say
to you,
something?
expect that.
So again, just a really compelling point. Wajahat goes on to echo that, saying how compassion is free. It doesn't cost anything, and Republicans can indeed afford to be compassionate at this time. Again, no satisfying answer to this from the MAGA guests. Dave Rubin tried, it has happened to us, and we have competent governance. Again, $120 billion given to Louisiana. Let's just use Louisiana as an example because Mike Johnson, the current Speaker of the House, represents Louisiana. $120 billion in aid over the past 20 years for various natural disasters, including Hurricane Katrina, federal assistance to Texas, to Florida. He can tout DeSantis' competence, but the fact of the matter is DeSantis asked for and received federal assistance for condo collapses, for various hurricanes and natural disasters under the Biden administration. This idea that, Florida is above federal assistance is absurd. And even if that were true about Florida, there are many other Republican states for which that is not true, that is less competently governed than Florida, that has less resources to deal with things independently than Florida. But even Florida is really no exception. The fact of the matter is Julie is right. And California, the fifth or sixth biggest economy in the world, an economic powerhouse, to which there is no red state that can compare to California despite all its issues. Again, Julie says what goes around comes around. The fact of the matter is I don't think Democrats have the backbone to ever condition aid the way that Republicans are advocating for. But it's certainly something that Democrats should threaten as Republicans threaten to do it with them. Like, hey, listen, if you do this, then that puts this on the table for the future, your states as well. So how about we just have a gentleman's understanding that as dirty as politics can get, when disasters strike red states or blue states, we come together and provide the funding. And then if afterwards you want to bitch about regulations or policy changes, feel free. You are free to criticize changes or policies that need to be changed under Democratic leaders or Republican leaders, but don't, for God's sake, condition aid to either Republican or red states. Give the aid. Put America first, then you can complain if there's something to complain about. Food for thought. In the meantime, let me know what you think in the comments.